Sign it.
About time. I received it. To new beginnings. You have no idea.
Patrick Sullivan was 39, a quiet operations consultant who looked more comfortable inside aging factories than luxury hotels. The Whitmore family believed he was an ordinary man who had married far above his station. His 7-year-old sedan-worn leather notebook and modest navy suit only confirmed what they thought they knew. What they didn't know was that 3 hours earlier he had quietly become the man who now controlled their century-old company. Then, Melanie slid a sealed envelope across the table, smiled without emotion, and said, "Sign it. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, tell me your country and your local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow-burning stories filled with suspense, unexpected twists, and satisfying justice, consider subscribing. Tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss." Patrick Sullivan had never cared about looking successful. Long before he learned how to negotiate multi-million-dollar transactions or stabilize failing manufacturers, he had learned something far less glamorous inside a small brick house on the outskirts of Fort Wayne, Indiana. His father, Michael Sullivan, spent 32 years on an automotive assembly line, leaving home before sunrise with a metal lunchbox that carried the same ham sandwich and apple and a thermos of black coffee almost every day. His mother, Linda Sullivan, managed the local public library, where silence was respected more than opinions, and books were treated with greater care than expensive possessions. Patrick grew up believing that a person's habits revealed more than their words. His father never complained about 12-hour shifts. He simply came home, washed the grease from his hands, ate dinner with the family, and returned to repairing whatever neighbor needed help. Sometimes it was an old lawnmower, sometimes a leaking roof, sometimes a teenager's first pickup truck that refused to start before school. Watching those evenings shaped Patrick more than any classroom ever could. Problems were not solved by shouting. They were solved by understanding how every small part connected to something larger. That lesson followed him into adulthood. While many of his classmates chased careers in finance or technology after graduating from Purdue University with a degree in industrial engineering, Patrick accepted an entry-level position with a manufacturing consulting firm in Indianapolis. The salary was average. The hours were exhausting. The factories were often old enough to belong in museums. He loved every minute. Most consultants preferred polished conference rooms where executives discussed spreadsheets. Patrick preferred steel-toed boots, noisy production floors, and conversations with machine operators who had spent 20 years standing beside the same equipment. Machines did not lie. Neither did production numbers. If something was failing, there was always a reason. Find the reason, and the solution usually followed. Within 10 years, Patrick had quietly earned a reputation throughout the Midwest as someone companies called only when situations had become serious. He was never the consultant hired to make presentations for investors. He was the consultant hired when payroll might not be met next month. He had helped a family-owned parts manufacturer in Ohio avoid bankruptcy by reorganizing production schedules instead of laying off half its workforce. He had modernized a packaging plant outside Milwaukee while keeping every employee on staff. In Detroit, he found enough operational waste inside a struggling supplier to save nearly $20 million over 3 years without closing a single factory. His name rarely appeared in newspapers. That suited him perfectly. The executives who truly mattered already knew who he was. The rest of the world didn't need to. Even after his annual income reached levels that surprised old college friends, Patrick's life barely changed. He still drove practical cars until they were no longer worth repairing. He still wore simple navy and charcoal suits purchased from the same tailor in downtown Chicago. His mechanical watch had been a gift from his father on the day Patrick accepted his first promotion. The leather notebook he carried had replaced dozens before it, each filled with handwritten observations instead of digital reminders. He trusted paper. Paper never ran out of battery. When Patrick eventually moved to Chicago, he rented a modest condominium overlooking the river instead of buying a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Friends occasionally joked that no one could guess his income by looking at his apartment. Patrick considered that a compliment. He met Melanie Whitmore on a rainy September evening during a charity fundraiser supporting vocational education programs across Illinois. Patrick had attended because one of his clients sponsored the event. Melanie attended because Whitmore Industrial Systems had donated nearly $500,000 to the foundation. The ballroom was filled with polished marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and conversations about investment portfolios. Patrick found himself standing near the coffee station, studying photographs of technical training schools funded by the charity. Melanie noticed him because he was one of the few guests actually reading every caption instead of networking. "You seem more interested in the students than the donors," she said. Patrick smiled. "I've met enough donors. And the students? They're the people who will actually build something," she laughed. It wasn't a rehearsed social laugh. It sounded genuine. They spent nearly 40 minutes talking before either asked what the other did for a living. Patrick liked that. Most conversations in Chicago started with job titles. This one started with ideas. Over the next year, they met regularly. Coffee shops replaced expensive restaurants. Walks along the Chicago River replaced exclusive clubs. Melanie admired Patrick's calm confidence. Patrick admired Melanie's intelligence and curiosity. When she spoke about branding strategies or customer loyalty, he listened carefully despite knowing very little about marketing. She listened just as carefully when he described production bottlenecks inside century-old factories. For a while, their differences felt complementary rather than conflicting. Everything changed the day Patrick met the Whitmore family. Charles Whitmore welcomed him with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. He shook Patrick's hand firmly. "So, you're the consultant?" Patrick nodded. "Operations consulting?" Charles glanced briefly at Patrick's watch before replying. "Interesting field." The conversation ended almost immediately. Evelyn Whitmore was considerably more polite. She asked about Patrick's parents, his education, his hometown. Her smile remained warm throughout dinner. But Patrick noticed how frequently she redirected conversations toward wealth private clubs, vacation homes, and charitable galas attended by Chicago's most influential families. Brandon Whitmore required even less time to reach his conclusion. "So you're basically the guy companies call when things go wrong." Patrick smiled. "Usually." Brandon chuckled. "I prefer companies that don't need fixing." Patrick simply nodded. There was no point arguing. Grace Whitmore hardly attempted to hide her disappointment. She had apparently expected her sister to marry someone whose last name regularly appeared in business magazines. Instead, she found a quiet consultant who discussed manufacturing efficiency with greater enthusiasm than luxury vacations. Patrick recognized the disappointment immediately. It didn't bother him. He had experienced similar reactions throughout much of his career. People often confused simplicity with limitation. Over the following years, Patrick attended birthdays, holidays, anniversary dinners, and charity galas with the Whitmores. He never raised his voice, never competed, never attempted to impress anyone. Ironically, the less he tried, the more determined Brandon became to prove Patrick wasn't worthy of joining the family. Whenever Patrick arrived in the same dependable sedan, Brandon made another joke. Whenever Patrick declined expensive golf memberships because he preferred hiking, Charles quietly questioned his ambition. Whenever Patrick wore the same mechanical watch, Grace suggested buying him something more appropriate. Patrick answered every remark with calm silence. He understood something the Whitmores never did. People who constantly measured others usually feared being measured themselves. Whitmore Industrial Systems appeared unstoppable from the outside. Founded nearly 90 years earlier, the company manufactured industrial pumps, hydraulic systems, and precision components used across North America. Its headquarters occupied an impressive glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. Nearly 4,000 employees worked across facilities in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. Business magazines frequently listed Charles Whitmore among the Midwest's most respected manufacturing executives. Annual reports looked impressive. Revenue continued growing. Charitable donations expanded every year. The company's image appeared flawless, but Patrick had spent enough years inside manufacturing businesses to recognize subtle warning signs invisible to most investors. A factory modernization project announced 2 years earlier kept missing deadlines. Several experienced plant managers quietly retired months earlier than expected. Industry suppliers occasionally mentioned unusually long payment cycles during ordinary conversations at trade conferences. Operating margins remained strangely flat despite public announcements celebrating record revenue. None of those details proved anything by themselves. Together, however, they formed a pattern. One Saturday afternoon after a family luncheon at the Whitmore estate in Lake Forest, Brandon, casually mentioned that the company had just completed another outstanding quarter. Patrick congratulated him politely. Brandon, eager to impress, began describing rising revenue while speaking about expansion plans. Patrick listened carefully. Something didn't fit. The production volumes Brandon casually referenced were inconsistent with publicly available manufacturing capacity estimates Patrick had reviewed only weeks earlier while researching an unrelated client. It was a tiny inconsistency, small enough that almost nobody would notice. Patrick did. And as they drove home beneath the gray Chicago sky, that single number refused to leave his mind. The number stayed with Patrick Sullivan all weekend. It was not dramatic. It was not large enough to make headlines. Most people would never have noticed it. But Patrick had spent nearly 2 decades studying manufacturing businesses, and he knew that companies rarely failed because of one catastrophic decision. They failed because dozens of small inconsistencies slowly connected into a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. On Monday morning, he arrived at the downtown Chicago office of one of his clients just before 7. While waiting for the weekly operations meeting, he opened his worn leather notebook and wrote one sentence. Whitmore production capacity does not support reported revenue growth. He underlined it once, nothing more. Patrick had learned years earlier that assumptions were dangerous. Observations were valuable. Conclusions required evidence. Over the following weeks, he resisted every temptation to investigate emotionally. Instead, he followed the same discipline he used for every troubled manufacturer he had ever analyzed. He started with public information. Whitmore Industrial Systems published annual reports, quarterly filings, and investor presentations, like every privately financed corporation seeking favorable lending terms. Patrick downloaded every document available over the previous 5 years. Each evening after work, he sat at the dining table inside his condominium overlooking the Chicago River with a calculator, financial statements, and a yellow legal pad. Melanie often noticed him working. "Another client?" Patrick looked up. "Something like that." She smiled politely before returning to her laptop. The conversations between them had become shorter over the past several months. Neither mentioned it. Patrick compared revenue trends against estimated production output. He reviewed capital expenditure announcements. He examined depreciation schedules. He tracked debt obligations reported through banking disclosures. Most people saw isolated numbers. Patrick saw relationships. Revenue had increased almost 23% over 3 years. Operating margins had barely moved. Normally, increased production efficiency should improve profitability. Instead, Whitmore's margins looked frozen. That alone wasn't proof. Commodity prices fluctuated. Labor costs changed. Supply chains experienced disruptions. But another detail caught his attention. Capital investments announced publicly exceeded what he estimated should have been visible inside the factories. He remembered visiting one Whitmore facility nearly 2 years earlier during a supplier appreciation event. The robotic welding line Charles proudly described as state-of-the-art had already appeared nearly 15 years old. Several automated systems had visible maintenance patches instead of factory replacement parts. At the time, Patrick had assumed modernization was already scheduled. Now he wondered whether it had ever happened. One evening, while attending an industry networking reception in Rosemont, Patrick spoke with an equipment supplier he had known for years. Their conversation never mentioned Whitmore directly. Instead, they discussed business across the Midwest. The supplier casually laughed. "Everybody wants new automation." Patrick smiled. "Few actually buy it." "You'd be surprised." The supplier took another sip of coffee. "Some companies announce projects just to impress lenders." Patrick raised an eyebrow. "Does that happen often?" "More than people think." Patrick changed the subject immediately. He had no interest in encouraging gossip. If there was truth to discover, it would come from documents rather than rumors. Days later, another unexpected observation appeared. A longtime maintenance supervisor from an Illinois manufacturing company mentioned accepting a new position after leaving Whitmore Industrial only 6 months earlier. Patrick knew the man professionally, reliable, experienced, not someone who changed employers without reason. "What made you leave?" Patrick asked. The supervisor hesitated. "Just felt like the right time." Patrick nodded. He didn't push. People rarely volunteered confidential information. A few moments later, however, the supervisor added something without being asked. "Some equipment shouldn't have been running as long as it did." Patrick remained silent. The supervisor looked around before continuing. "I probably shouldn't say more." "You don't have to." Patrick never asked another question. The conversation ended there. That single sentence joined the growing collection inside Patrick's notebook. No accusations, only observations, equipment operating beyond expected maintenance cycles. Several weeks later, another familiar face disappeared. During a manufacturing conference in Indianapolis, Patrick searched for an old acquaintance who had managed production scheduling at Whitmore's Ohio facility for nearly 18 years. Instead, another attendee informed him the manager had accepted early retirement. "Health reasons?" Patrick asked. "No." The attendee shrugged. "He just said it wasn't the same company anymore." Patrick thanked him. Again, another piece. Still not enough. At home, Melanie became increasingly distracted. She answered work calls in another room. Weekend breakfasts became hurried. Some evenings, she returned home after 9 without explanation beyond saying she had attended another executive meeting with her father. Patrick never questioned her schedule. He understood demanding careers. Still, something had changed. One Friday evening, he prepared dinner before she arrived. Grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, fresh bread from a neighborhood bakery. The food sat untouched for nearly 40 minutes before Melanie entered, carrying her laptop. "I'm sorry." She sounded exhausted. "We had another finance meeting." Patrick placed dinner onto her plate. "Tough week." She hesitated. "You could say that." He waited. She never continued. Instead, she asked about one of Patrick's consulting projects. The conversation shifted elsewhere. The silence between them lasted longer than the meal itself. Weeks later, the Whitmore family hosted another Sunday gathering at Charles and Evelyn's estate in Lake Forest. The afternoon looked perfect. Freshly cut lawns, classic cars parked along the circular driveway, waiters carrying trays through the backyard. Everything reflected success. Everything appeared controlled. Patrick noticed Brandon speaking animatedly with several commercial bankers near the patio. As the conversation ended, Brandon walked toward him, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. "Still fixing broken factories?" Brandon asked. Patrick accepted the drink. "Business has been good?" Brandon smiled. "You should come work for Whitmore someday." Patrick laughed quietly. I don't think your father would enjoy that. Brandon laughed louder. He'd never survive letting an outsider tell him how to run his company. Patrick simply nodded. A few moments later, Brandon leaned closer. We're preparing another expansion. Congratulations. Our best financial year yet. Patrick noticed Brandon's confidence. It sounded genuine, but genuine confidence and accurate numbers were not always the same thing. As the afternoon continued, Charles gathered family members around the patio for photographs. Patrick watched him carefully. Charles still looked commanding, still charismatic, still admired. Yet Patrick noticed something else. Whenever business came up, Charles redirected conversations almost immediately. Years earlier, he had enjoyed discussing manufacturing. Now he preferred discussing awards, charitable foundations, and magazine recognition. The shift was subtle. Most guests never noticed. Patrick did. Successful manufacturing executives usually enjoyed talking about production improvements. Executives hiding operational problems preferred talking about reputation. Driving back toward downtown Chicago that evening, Melanie stared out the passenger window. Patrick kept his eyes on the highway. Finally, he spoke. Everything okay? She nodded too quickly. Just tired. You've seemed tired for months. She looked at him briefly. Work has been stressful. Patrick waited. Again, she said nothing else. The city skyline appeared ahead, glowing beneath the evening sky. For the first time since they married, Patrick felt that someone had quietly built a wall between them. He couldn't see who had built it. He only knew it was there. The following Tuesday, while reviewing emails between client meetings, Patrick noticed an unfamiliar name. Daniel Carter, Senior Partner, Lakefront Capital Partners. Subject line: request for confidential meeting. Patrick frowned slightly. He had met Daniel only twice during industry conferences years earlier. The message was concise. Patrick, I've followed your operational work for some time. I believe we have a matter of mutual professional interest involving a Midwest manufacturer. Nothing confidential is expected from you. I'd simply appreciate your perspective as someone with deep operational experience. If you're available lunch this Thursday at Gibson's on North Rush Street. Daniel Carter. Patrick read the message twice. There was no mention of Whitmore Industrial, no indication of acquisitions, nothing improper. Still, instinct told him the timing was not accidental. He closed his notebook. For the first time since noticing Brandon's impossible numbers, Patrick felt that the scattered pieces might finally be moving toward one another. He accepted the invitation. Patrick arrived at Gibson's Steakhouse 15 minutes early. Punctuality had become second nature after years of managing factory shutdowns that cost thousands of dollars for every hour lost. He chose a quiet table away from the lunch crowd, ordered black coffee, and placed his leather notebook beside the cup. At exactly noon, Daniel Carter walked through the front entrance. He was in his early 50s, tall, gray-haired, wearing a dark charcoal suit that looked expensive without trying to advertise itself. Patrick remembered him from 2 manufacturing conferences years earlier. Daniel had spoken little during those events, but when he did, executives listened. He approached with an easy smile. Patrick Sullivan. Patrick stood and shook his hand. Daniel, it's been a while. It has. They sat. Neither man rushed into business. They spoke first about Chicago traffic, Indiana basketball, and the surprising recovery of several Midwestern manufacturers after the pandemic years. Daniel eventually folded his napkin onto the table. I appreciate you coming. Patrick nodded. You mentioned a professional matter. I did. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Our firm has been studying a manufacturing company for quite some time. Patrick remained silent. We're interested in your operational perspective. I assume there's a reason you contacted me instead of another consultant. There is. Daniel smiled politely. You're known for seeing problems before balance sheets reveal them. Patrick took a sip of coffee. That's generous. It's accurate. The waiter arrived with menus. Both men ordered without discussing business further. Only after lunch was served did Daniel continue. "I want to be very clear about something." Patrick listened. "I'm not asking for confidential information." "Good. I don't want information obtained through your marriage." Patrick appreciated hearing those words. "If that had been your intention," he replied, "this meeting would already be over." Daniel nodded. "That's exactly why you're here." For several moments, neither man spoke. Finally, Daniel opened a thin folder. Inside were public financial reports Patrick had already reviewed himself. "You've probably seen these." "I have. What concerns you?" Patrick answered carefully. "The numbers raise questions." "What kind of questions?" "Questions requiring independent verification." Daniel waited. Patrick continued. "Reported revenue growth doesn't align with observable operational capacity. No accusations. None. Just observations." Patrick nodded. "I don't deal in accusations." Daniel turned another page. "What about capital investments?" Patrick chose every word deliberately. "Public announcements describe modernization." And, "I haven't personally seen evidence consistent with the scale being described." Daniel wrote nothing. He simply listened. Patrick appreciated that. Consultants often talked too much. Investors often interrupted too quickly. Daniel did neither. After another pause, he asked, "Would you be surprised if I told you we've monitored Whitmore Industrial for over 2 years?" Patrick wasn't surprised. "No, we believe it's a strong company." Patrick agreed. "It could be. But strong companies sometimes develop weak leadership." Daniel smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say something like that." Patrick leaned back. "I'm still not offering conclusions." "I know." Daniel closed the folder. "Our investment committee has considered acquiring Whitmore several times." Patrick remained expressionless. "The valuation never made sense." Patrick understood immediately. Public numbers often determined acquisition prices. If the numbers were misleading, so was the valuation. Daniel continued. "We've delayed making an offer because something hasn't added up." Patrick looked toward the restaurant window overlooking North Rush Street. Chicago moved at its usual pace outside. Business people hurried across intersections. Tourists photographed buildings. No one walking past the restaurant had any idea that a conversation inside might eventually reshape one of the Midwest's oldest manufacturers. Daniel broke the silence. "If we move forward, everything must remain above reproach." Patrick answered without hesitation. "That's the only way I'd participate." Daniel nodded. "Good. I won't discuss family conversations." "I wouldn't ask." "I won't disclose confidential information." "I don't want it." "I won't breach legal or ethical obligations." Daniel smiled. "Then we're in complete agreement." Lunch ended less than an hour later. Before leaving, Daniel handed Patrick a business card. "If our team begins formal due diligence, we may occasionally ask general operational questions based entirely on public information." Patrick accepted the card. "If the questions stay within those boundaries, I'll answer." They shook hands once more. Neither realized that the lunch marked the beginning of an 11-month journey. 3 weeks later, Daniel called again. "Would you be willing to meet our due diligence team, Gwan?" Patrick agreed. The meeting took place inside Lakefront Capital Partners offices overlooking the Chicago River. Unlike the polished image projected by many investment firms, the conference room contained almost no decoration, only charts, industry reports, maps showing manufacturing facilities across the Midwest. Daniel introduced 2 additional people. "Patrick, this is Rebecca Hayes." Rebecca stood and extended her hand. She was in her mid-40s, with short brown hair and calm eyes that suggested she had spent years examining financial statements few people truly understood. "I'm a forensic accountant." Patrick smiled. "I've heard good things." Mostly from auditors. I'll take that as a compliment. Daniel introduced the final participant. Thomas Reynolds. Thomas looked older than everyone else in the room. His navy suit was conservative. His briefcase appeared older than some junior associates. I'm outside legal counsel. Patrick shook his hand. Thomas spoke only one sentence. My job is making sure everyone sleeps well after the transaction. Patrick liked him immediately. The meeting began with strict ground rules. Thomas reviewed confidentiality agreements. Rebecca explained the boundaries of due diligence. Daniel emphasized that every conclusion had to come from independently verified records. Patrick appreciated the discipline. No shortcuts, no rumors, no hidden recordings, only documents, only facts. Weeks became months. Rebecca's team requested thousands of pages of publicly obtainable records, supplier contracts, environmental filings, maintenance reports, lending documents, and regulatory disclosures. Patrick occasionally answered questions involving manufacturing processes or industry benchmarks. Nothing more. Late one afternoon, Rebecca invited him into a conference room. Several spreadsheets covered the large display screen. We've confirmed something. Patrick looked quietly at the numbers. What? Maintenance spending. She highlighted multiple years. The reported capital improvements don't match actual equipment replacement cycles. Patrick studied the data. How confident? 99%. She selected another document. Pension obligations. Patrick read silently. Funding levels had quietly deteriorated. Again, nothing illegal by itself, but concerning. Rebecca continued. Now look at vendor payment schedules. Several major suppliers had waited increasingly longer for payment over consecutive years. Cash flow pressure. Patrick recognized the pattern immediately. Healthy manufacturers rarely stretched reliable suppliers unless liquidity had become tight. Thomas entered carrying another folder. We've also found communications with lenders. Patrick looked up. Misrepresentations, Thomas answered carefully. We're still verifying. Patrick appreciated the wording. Still verifying, not assuming. Daniel joined them moments later. So, Rebecca looked toward him. The operational picture is significantly weaker than public perception. Daniel remained thoughtful. No dramatic fraud? Not yet. But enough risk, Rebecca nodded. Much more than expected. Another month passed. Additional evidence continued accumulating. Deferred maintenance, inflated asset valuations, delayed modernization, pension shortfalls. Several acquisitions that appeared successful publicly had generated little measurable return. Every new discovery strengthened one conclusion. Whitmore Industrial still possessed tremendous potential. The factories, the workforce, the customer relationships. Those remained valuable. The problem appeared concentrated elsewhere. One rainy Thursday evening, Lakefront Capital's investment committee gathered for its final review. Patrick was invited only for operational questions. He answered each carefully. No exaggeration, no emotion. After nearly 3 hours, Daniel thanked him. We'll take it from here. Patrick stood. I appreciate being included. As he reached the conference room door, Daniel spoke once more. One last question. Patrick turned. If this acquisition happens, he paused. Would you be willing to help lead the turnaround? Patrick didn't answer immediately. His thoughts moved to nearly 4,000 employees spread across 4 states. Machine operators, maintenance crews, engineers, shipping clerks, families who depended on weekly paychecks. Not executives, workers. If every step remains lawful, Patrick finally replied, and if protecting those employees is the priority. Daniel finished the sentence for him. Then, Patrick nodded once. Yes. The following morning, Daniel called before 8. The investment committee had reached its decision. Lakefront Capital Partners had voted unanimously. They would pursue the acquisition of Whitmore Industrial Systems. Patrick closed his notebook slowly. Outside his office window, downtown Chicago looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Inside, however, the first irreversible step had just been taken. The first person who realized Patrick Sullivan had changed was not his wife. It was the concierge in his office building. For nearly 6 years, Patrick had walked through the lobby every weekday with the same quiet routine. He greeted the security guards by name. He carried his own briefcase. He stopped for black coffee from the cafe beside the elevators and never looked hurried, even when his schedule was packed. After the investment committee approved pursuing Whitmore Industrial Systems, nothing about that routine changed. That surprised everyone working with him. Daniel Carter had expected Patrick to become consumed by the transaction. Instead, Patrick continued visiting factories across Illinois, reviewing production lines, and helping existing clients solve ordinary problems. "You're acting like nothing's happening," Daniel remarked during one conference call. Patrick smiled. "Something is happening. It doesn't look like it. It shouldn't." Daniel understood. The acquisition would require months of negotiations, financing approvals, legal reviews, regulatory filings, and confidential discussions. One careless conversation could jeopardize everything. The quieter Patrick remained, the safer everyone involved would be. While Patrick's professional life became increasingly confidential, his marriage became increasingly distant. The changes appeared slowly, almost politely. Melanie no longer asked how his day had gone. She stopped waiting for him before eating dinner. Weekend mornings that once included long walks beside Lake Michigan quietly disappeared. Instead, she spent more time with her parents in Lake Forest. Sometimes she said she was helping her mother organize charity events. Other weekends, she claimed Charles needed her opinion on marketing initiatives. Patrick never questioned her explanations. He simply noticed how frequently they occurred. One Friday evening, he returned home, carrying fresh pasta from a neighborhood Italian market they both loved. The apartment lights were off. A note rested on the kitchen counter. "Dinner with my family. Don't wait up." Melanie Patrick placed the groceries into the refrigerator one item at a time. Fresh basil, tomatoes, Parmesan cheese, Italian bread. He prepared dinner anyway. Cooking had always helped him think. As water boiled on the stove, he opened his notebook. Instead of writing about Whitmore Industrial, he wrote something entirely different. Conversations becoming shorter, family gatherings increasing, emotional distance growing. No conclusions, only observations. His father had once told him that relationships often resembled machinery. "If something starts making a different sound," Michael Sullivan had said while repairing an old pickup truck, "don't ignore it just because it's still running." Patrick understood that lesson now more than ever. 2 weeks later, Evelyn Whitmore invited the entire family to Sunday brunch. The Whitmore estate overlooked a private golf course north of Chicago. Luxury cars filled the circular driveway. Garden staff trimmed hedges with military precision. Everything reflected prosperity. Patrick parked his aging sedan beside Brandon's newest imported sports car. Grace noticed immediately. She smiled as Patrick approached. "I was wondering how much longer that thing would survive." Patrick glanced toward his car. "It still gets me where I need to go." She laughed. "I suppose reliability is fashionable now." Patrick smiled politely. "I've always thought so." Inside the dining room, Charles welcomed guests with effortless confidence. Business leaders, family friends, bank executives, several members of a local charitable foundation. Patrick noticed conversations revolving around investment portfolios, vacation homes, and exclusive clubs. No one discussed manufacturing. No one discussed workers. No one mentioned factories. During brunch, Brandon intentionally raised his voice. "So, Patrick." Several guests looked toward them. "How many factories are you fixing these days?" Patrick calmly set down his coffee. "A few." "A few?" Brandon laughed. "I imagine that keeps you busy." "It does." Charles joined the conversation. "You know, Patrick has always preferred smaller operations." Patrick recognized the implication. Small, ordinary, limited. He simply nodded. Charles continued. Running a major corporation requires a different perspective, Patrick answered evenly. I imagine it does. Brandon smirked. Fortunately, Dad has decades of experience. Patrick looked directly at him. Experience is valuable. The response disappointed Brandon. He wanted disagreement. Patrick offered none. Across the table, Melanie remained unusually quiet. Months earlier, she would have changed the subject. Now she focused on her plate. Patrick noticed. He said nothing. Later that afternoon, while guests wandered through the garden, Evelyn joined Melanie near the fountain. Patrick saw them talking from across the lawn. Their expressions were serious. Evelyn rested a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. Melanie nodded several times. When Patrick approached moments later, the conversation ended immediately. We were just discussing the charity gala next month, Evelyn explained smoothly. Patrick smiled. I'm sure it'll be successful. He walked away. He didn't believe the explanation. But he also understood something else. If Melanie wished to tell him something, she would. If she didn't, asking harder questions wouldn't produce honest answers. Meanwhile, the acquisition continued advancing. Thomas Reynolds spent countless hours reviewing legal documentation. Rebecca Hayes's forensic team expanded its analysis. Banks evaluated financing structures. Independent valuation specialists inspected Whitmore facilities without drawing unnecessary attention. Patrick participated only when necessary. His role remained carefully limited. He refused access to confidential marital information. He avoided discussing family conversations. Several times, Daniel thanked him for maintaining those boundaries. You've made our legal team's job much easier, Thomas remarked. Patrick shrugged. Doing the right thing usually simplifies paperwork. Thomas laughed. I wish every executive understood that. One evening, Daniel invited Patrick to review preliminary financing models. After nearly 4 hours discussing debt structures, equity commitments, and operational projections, Daniel closed his laptop. Can I ask something unrelated? Patrick nodded. How's your marriage? Patrick looked toward the conference room window. Chicago's skyline shimmered beyond the glass. It's changing. Daniel waited. I don't know into what. You haven't told Melanie. About the acquisition. Daniel nodded. Patrick answered immediately. I can't. Because of confidentiality? And because it isn't finished. Daniel understood. Public companies collapsed over leaked information. Private acquisitions could fail just as easily. Until contracts were signed, silence remained essential. Weeks later, Patrick noticed another subtle change. Melanie began receiving phone calls she always answered outside the apartment. She occasionally returned carrying folders she immediately stored inside her home office. One evening, Patrick accidentally entered the room while searching for a charger. Melanie quickly closed a document. He apologized. She smiled awkwardly. No problem. Neither mentioned the incident again. Patrick never searched through her belongings. Trust meant respecting boundaries, even when uncertainty became uncomfortable. Another family dinner arrived. This one took place at an upscale restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. Brandon dominated the conversation with stories about luxury investments. Grace described expensive real estate transactions. Charles spoke proudly about Whitmore's public reputation. Patrick mostly listened. Near dessert, Evelyn looked toward him. So, Patrick. Yes. Have you ever considered changing careers? The table became quiet. Patrick answered honestly. I enjoy what I do. But surely you've thought about something bigger. Patrick smiled gently. I've never measured careers by size. Brandon chuckled. That's because you've never run a billion-dollar company. Patrick met his eyes. No. Then he returned to eating dessert. The silence frustrated Brandon more than any argument could have. Driving home that night, Melanie finally spoke. My family can be difficult. Patrick kept his eyes on the road. They love you. They don't always show it. Patrick smiled faintly. I've noticed. She looked out the passenger window. I'm sorry. It was the first apology she had offered in months. Patrick appreciated it, but apologies like machinery required maintenance afterward. Otherwise, they became only words. Several days later, while returning from a client meeting in Milwaukee, Patrick found a large certified envelope waiting outside his condominium door. Inside were copies of updated financial statements from his accountant. He had requested a complete review of every personal asset months earlier. Not because he expected divorce, because Thomas Reynolds had advised him to ensure every financial record remained impeccably organized before the acquisition advanced further. Patrick spent the evening updating account records, insurance policies, property documents, and investment statements. Everything remained transparent. Everything carefully documented. His own attorney reviewed the files and nodded approvingly. You like being prepared. Patrick smiled. I dislike surprises. The attorney closed the folder. I hope you never need any of this. Patrick quietly looked toward the window. So do I. 3 days later, while leaving another client meeting, his phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar law office. He answered. Patrick Sullivan. The receptionist spoke politely. Mr. Sullivan, we're trying to confirm an appointment with Mrs. Melanie Sullivan for next Thursday. Patrick remained silent for a moment. I'm sorry. We may have contacted the wrong number. The call ended almost immediately. Patrick stared at the phone. He didn't react. He didn't call Melanie. He didn't ask questions. But deep inside, something settled into place. That evening, another email arrived. This one came from Evelyn Whitmore. She warmly invited Patrick and Melanie to attend Charles and Evelyn's 40th wedding anniversary celebration at the Langham, Chicago, the following Saturday. Patrick read the invitation twice. Every instinct told him the evening would not be a celebration. It would be a performance. He accepted anyway. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of weather Chicago reserved for postcards. The air was warm. The sky above the river glowed orange before fading into deep blue as the lights of downtown reflected across the water. Valets in white gloves stood outside the Langham, Chicago, greeting guests arriving in luxury sedans and chauffeur-driven SUVs. Patrick parked his own 7-year-old sedan in the self-parking garage 2 blocks away. He had never cared whether people noticed. Tonight, however, several members of the Whitmore family noticed anyway. As Patrick entered the grand ballroom, Grace glanced toward the entrance and whispered something to Brandon. Both laughed quietly. Patrick pretended not to see. The ballroom had been transformed for Charles and Evelyn Whitmore's 40th wedding anniversary. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished marble floors. White roses decorated every table. A jazz quartet performed near the windows overlooking the Chicago River. Nearly 200 guests filled the room. Business executives, bank presidents, local politicians, charity board members, family friends. The Whitmores had invited everyone who mattered to their public image. Patrick greeted several guests he genuinely respected. A retired factory owner from Rockford, a former union representative from Indiana, an engineering professor from Northwestern University. Interestingly, conversations with those people lasted longer than conversations with most members of the Whitmore family, because they discussed work instead of status. Melanie arrived nearly 20 minutes after Patrick. She wore an elegant ivory evening gown. Her smile appeared flawless. Only someone who knew her well would notice how carefully controlled every expression had become. Patrick noticed. She kissed her mother on the cheek. She embraced Grace. She greeted Brandon. When she finally reached Patrick, she smiled politely. Thanks for coming. I wouldn't miss your parents' anniversary. Her smile faded almost immediately. I'll see you inside. There was no warmth, No hostility either, only distance. Patrick watched her walk toward the family table. Something inside him quietly accepted what he had resisted admitting for months. Whatever remained of their marriage was already disappearing. Dinner began promptly at 7. Charles welcomed everyone with effortless confidence. He thanked old friends, celebrated 40 years of marriage, shared stories about building Whitmore Industrial from a regional manufacturer into a nationally respected company. The audience applauded repeatedly. Patrick applauded as well. Much of what Charles described was true. He had built an extraordinary business. That reality made the company's recent decline even more unfortunate. Course after course arrived. Wine glasses were refilled. Guests laughed. Music continued softly in the background. Patrick noticed Daniel Carter's name appear briefly on his phone. No message, only a missed call. Patrick silenced the screen without checking further. If Daniel needed him urgently, he would call again. For now, Patrick remained exactly where he was supposed to be. Near the end of dinner, Evelyn stood. She thanked everyone for celebrating with them. Then she smiled toward Melanie. "My daughter has something she'd like to share." Several guests turned toward Melanie. Patrick did as well. She stood slowly. One waiter quietly placed a thin, cream-colored envelope beside her plate. Patrick recognized immediately what it was. Not because he had seen the document, because he had seen enough legal correspondence throughout his career to recognize the presentation. Melanie picked up the envelope. Her hands were steady. She walked around the table until she stood beside Patrick. The ballroom gradually became quiet. Patrick slowly looked up at her. She met his eyes for only a moment. Then she placed the envelope directly in front of him. "I think it's time." Her voice remained calm. "I've filed for divorce." Silence spread across the ballroom. Several guests looked away uncomfortably. Others watched with open curiosity. Patrick rested one hand on the envelope. He neither opened it nor reacted immediately. Across the table, Brandon leaned back in his chair with an unmistakable grin. "I guess some stories don't get happy endings." A few guests laughed nervously. Grace smiled openly. "I always thought Melanie deserved someone more established." Evelyn reached across the table and gently squeezed her daughter's hand. "You've made a difficult decision." Charles stood slowly. He raised his wine glass. "Sometimes courage means recognizing when a relationship has reached its natural conclusion." Several guests applauded politely. Patrick remained seated. He finally opened the envelope. Inside were professionally prepared divorce papers. Every page had been carefully organized, every signature line clearly marked. Patrick read only the first page, then the second. Nothing surprised him. The filing cited irreconcilable differences, no accusations, no financial allegations, no public scandal, simply the legal ending of a marriage. Patrick removed a pen from his jacket pocket. Brandon watched with obvious satisfaction. "So that's it." Patrick looked toward him. "It's acknowledgement of receipt." Brandon shrugged. "Same difference." Patrick signed exactly where the document required. Nothing more, nothing less. He slid the papers back into the envelope. Melanie accepted them without speaking. The ballroom remained strangely quiet. Many guests had expected shouting, arguments, pleading. Instead, they had witnessed administrative professionalism. The absence of emotion somehow felt more uncomfortable than anger would have. Patrick folded his napkin carefully beside his plate. At that precise moment, his phone vibrated once inside his jacket. A single silent notification. He glanced downward. Daniel Carter. Transaction closed. Board resolution executed. Ownership transfer complete. Patrick read the notification exactly once. His thumb locked the screen. He placed the phone back inside his pocket. No smile appeared. No visible reaction crossed his face. Only Patrick knew that less than 10 seconds earlier, Lakefront Capital Partners had officially completed the acquisition of Whitmore Industrial Systems, legally, irrevocably. The Whitmore family no longer controlled the company that had carried their name for generations. Around the ballroom, no one noticed anything had changed. Charles lifted his wine glass again. To new beginnings. More applause followed. Patrick quietly stood. He looked first at Melanie. I received the documents. She nodded silently. Then he turned toward Charles and Evelyn. Thank you for inviting me this evening. Charles answered with restrained confidence. I wish you the best moving forward. Patrick inclined his head politely. And I wish your family well. Brandon laughed. You'll land on your feet. Patrick smiled faintly. I usually do. Grace crossed her arms. I suppose you'll need some time to figure out what's next. Patrick looked at her for a brief second. I already have. She misunderstood the answer completely. Everyone did. Patrick picked up his jacket. He walked through the ballroom without hurrying. Several guests stepped aside quietly. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked embarrassed. A few simply watched. The elevator doors closed behind him. Only then did Patrick remove his phone once more. The acquisition file contained 3 new messages. The first came from Daniel Carter. Everything is complete. Congratulations, Executive Chairman. The second came from Thomas Reynolds. Legal closing successful. Transition begins Monday at 8:00 a.m. The third came from Marcus Bennett. See you in the boardroom. Patrick slipped the phone back into his pocket. He stood alone inside the elevator as it descended toward the lobby. Outside, the Chicago night remained calm. Traffic continued moving along Wacker Drive. Boats drifted across the river. The city had no idea that one family's celebration had ended at the exact moment another chapter of corporate history had quietly begun. Upstairs, the Whitmore family continued celebrating what they believed was their greatest victory. None of them realized they had just applauded only minutes after losing the company that defined their name. Patrick slept for just under 5 hours, not because he was anxious, because acquisitions did not pause for emotions. By 6 o'clock Sunday morning, he was already sitting at the small kitchen table inside his condominium, a mug of black coffee beside him, and the same worn leather notebook open to a blank page. He wrote only one sentence: protect the people before protecting the headlines. He underlined it once. That sentence had guided every turnaround he had ever led. It would guide this one as well. His phone rang exactly at 7. Daniel Carter. Morning? Morning, Patrick answered. You get any sleep? Enough. Daniel laughed softly. I was afraid you'd say that. Patrick looked out the window toward the Chicago River. Everything finalized. Every signature. Funding. Released. Escrow. Completed. The board, Daniel smiled through the phone, officially reconstituted as of 11:43 p.m. Patrick closed his notebook. So tomorrow becomes day 1. It does. Daniel paused before continuing. I thought you should know something. I'm listening. Charles doesn't know. Patrick wasn't surprised. Neither does Brandon. Patrick remained silent. Melanie doesn't know either. That answer lingered for several seconds. Patrick had expected Charles to remain unaware. The confidentiality agreements made certain of that. But hearing that Melanie genuinely knew, nothing brought an unexpected heaviness. Not regret, just sadness. Whatever existed between them had become so distant that one of the largest moments of Patrick's professional life had happened without the woman he married knowing anything about it. Daniel interrupted his thoughts. You still comfortable representing the ownership group? Patrick answered immediately. Yes. Even after last night. Patrick looked toward the divorce papers resting neatly inside a drawer. Especially after last night. Daniel said nothing for several moments. Finally, he replied quietly, "I hoped you'd say that." The remainder of Sunday disappeared into preparation. By 9 o'clock, Patrick sat inside Lakefront Capital's headquarters with Thomas Reynolds' Marcus Bennett and 6 senior transition specialists. No one celebrated. Corporate acquisitions rarely resembled the movies. There were no champagne bottles, no applause, only binders, legal documents, security schedules, employee communication plans. Thomas stood beside a large screen displaying Monday's timeline. 6:30. He pointed toward the first item. IT begins administrative credential updates. Next. 7 o'clock. Independent cybersecurity team freezes executive-level permissions. Next. 7:15. Outside accounting team secures financial records. Next. 7:30. Human resources receives board resolutions. Next. 7:45. Security receives updated authorization list. Finally. 8 o'clock. He looked around the room. Emergency board meeting. Patrick carefully reviewed every page. No names appeared on termination notices. Instead, every document used the same language. Administrative leave pending review. Authority suspended pending investigation. Records preserved for independent examination. Patrick appreciated the precision. Justice required patience, not assumptions. Marcus Bennett, the newly appointed independent chairman, closed his folder. I know what everyone expects. The room became quiet. They expect a purge. He looked toward Patrick. That won't happen. Patrick nodded. We don't know who's responsible yet. Marcus smiled. Exactly. He turned toward the transition team. No one loses a job tomorrow simply because they worked under previous management. Several people around the table visibly relaxed. Patrick noticed. That mattered. Companies often destroyed themselves during ownership transitions by allowing fear to spread faster than information. He had no intention of repeating that mistake. Around noon, Rebecca Hayes arrived carrying 3 thick archive boxes. Every box contained months of forensic findings. She carefully placed them on the conference table. We're ready? Patrick looked at the labels. Vendor analysis, capital projects, financial controls. Rebecca noticed his expression. I wish there were fewer. Patrick smiled faintly. I imagine so. She opened the first box. Everything here has been independently verified. She tapped the folders gently. If someone challenges a conclusion, we have supporting documentation. Patrick asked only one question. Anything speculative? Rebecca shook her head. It didn't make the file. Good. She understood exactly why that answer mattered. Speculation belonged in conversations. Evidence belonged in boardrooms. Sunday afternoon became a sequence of conference calls. Commercial lenders, insurance representatives, outside legal counsel, regulatory advisors. Every discussion ended with the same instruction: maintain confidentiality until Monday morning. At 4 o'clock, Patrick finally returned home. The apartment felt unusually quiet. Melanie had already removed several personal belongings during the previous week. The bookshelf beside the living room window now contained empty spaces where framed photographs had once stood. Their bedroom closet looked noticeably different. Patrick noticed every missing item. He refused to dwell on any of them. Instead, he opened the kitchen cabinet, prepared another pot of coffee, and reviewed Monday's employee announcement. The first paragraph immediately caught his attention. He crossed out an entire sentence. Daniel happened to call while Patrick was editing. What changed? Patrick read the original wording aloud. The company enters a new era of operational excellence. Daniel waited. Patrick continued. It sounds like marketing. What did you replace it with? Patrick read again. Our first responsibility is ensuring stability for employees, customers, and suppliers. Daniel laughed quietly. That sounds like you. It sounds truthful. Even better. An hour later, Thomas called. "I've reviewed your revisions." "And I left every one of them," Patrick smiled. "Employees don't care about slogans. They care about paychecks." Exactly. Sunday evening brought one final meeting. Only 4 people attended: Daniel, Thomas, Marcus, Patrick. The conference room overlooked downtown Chicago as lights slowly illuminated the skyline. Marcus folded his hands. "I want everyone to understand tomorrow." He looked first at Daniel. "We are not walking into that building to defeat a family." Daniel nodded. Marcus turned toward Patrick. "We're walking in to save a company." Patrick answered quietly. "And protect 4,000 families who depend on it." Marcus smiled. "Exactly." Thomas checked his watch. One more legal matter. Everyone looked toward him. "The acquisition closed cleanly." He paused. "But once tomorrow begins..." His voice became noticeably more serious. Every decision made by the previous executive team becomes subject to preservation requirements." Patrick understood immediately. "No documents destroyed. No emails deleted. No servers altered." Thomas nodded. "Everything stays exactly where it is." Daniel added one final instruction. "If anyone becomes emotional tomorrow..." Patrick smiled faintly. "They won't be me." The meeting ended shortly before 8. Patrick drove home through unusually light Sunday evening traffic. He crossed the Chicago River while watching reflections ripple beneath the bridge. His phone remained silent. No calls from Melanie. No messages from the Whitmore family. He expected none. Back inside the condominium, he hung his navy suit carefully beside the closet. Tomorrow required something different. He selected a charcoal suit instead. The same mechanical watch his father had given him years earlier rested on the dresser. Patrick picked it up. The leather strap showed signs of age. The crystal contained several tiny scratches. He smiled. His father had once said, "If something still works, don't replace it just because someone richer owns something newer." Patrick fastened the watch around his wrist. It still kept perfect time. Before going to bed, he opened the leather notebook one final time. Below the sentence he had written that morning, he added another. "Power changes people only if they wanted power more than responsibility." He closed the notebook. At precisely 5:15 Monday morning, the alarm sounded. Patrick dressed quietly. Black coffee, toast, nothing else. By 6:30 a.m., transition teams had already entered Whitmore Industrial Headquarters through employee entrances reserved for authorized personnel. IT specialists began implementing new security protocols. Outside counsel verified board resolutions. Cybersecurity consultants quietly suspended executive administrative privileges. No announcements had been made. Employees arriving for work noticed only a few unfamiliar faces in business suits speaking softly with building security. Inside the executive boardroom, fresh folders had been placed at every chair. Each folder carried the same title: Board Governance Transition. At 7:58 a.m., Patrick stepped out of the elevator alongside Daniel Carter, Thomas Reynolds, Rebecca Hayes, and Marcus Bennett. Beyond the closed boardroom doors, Charles Whitmore's voice could already be heard greeting directors as though it were any ordinary Monday morning. None of the people inside knew they were about to attend the first board meeting of a company they no longer controlled. The executive boardroom on the 32nd floor had not changed in years. A polished walnut table stretched nearly 30 feet from end to end. Framed photographs lined one wall, all each capturing milestones from Whitmore Industrial Systems' 90-year history. Charles Whitmore stood smiling in almost every picture: groundbreaking ceremonies, factory expansions, awards, magazine covers. To anyone entering the room that Monday morning, the photographs suggested permanence. Patrick knew better. Ownership could change with a single signature. At 7:59 a.m., Charles Whitmore entered first. He carried himself exactly as he had for decades: confident, unhurried, completely certain that every room inside the building belonged to him. He greeted 2 independent directors before taking his usual seat at the head of the table. "Morning, everyone." His voice carried the calm authority employees had trusted for years. Brandon arrived moments later carrying a tablet computer. He frowned immediately. "My executive login isn't working." Charles barely looked up. "Call it." "I already did." "They're updating security certificates." Charles dismissed the inconvenience with a wave of his hand. "It happens." Brandon accepted the explanation. Melanie entered next. Unlike previous Mondays, she looked distracted. Sleep had done little to hide the emotional exhaustion from Saturday evening. She nodded politely toward several board members before choosing her seat farther down the table. No one mentioned the divorce. Corporate meetings followed their own rules. Personal matters remained outside the boardroom. At least that was the expectation. By 8:01 a.m., every scheduled director had arrived. The room waited for Charles to begin. Instead, the conference room doors opened. Everyone looked toward the entrance. Marcus Bennett entered first. Several directors exchanged confused glances. Only a handful recognized him from previous governance conferences. Behind Marcus walked Thomas Reynolds carrying a leather portfolio. Rebecca Hayes followed with 2 archive boxes. Daniel Carter entered next. Silence began spreading through the room. Finally, Patrick stepped through the doorway. He wore the same charcoal suit he had prepared the night before, the same mechanical watch, the same calm expression. Nothing about his appearance suggested triumph. Nothing about his posture suggested revenge. He simply walked to the opposite end of the table. Charles frowned. "Patrick." Patrick inclined his head politely. "Good morning." Brandon looked toward Melanie. "What is this?" She shook her head. "I don't know." Charles turned toward Daniel. "I'm afraid you've entered the wrong meeting." Daniel smiled courteously. "No, Mr. Whitmore." He placed a folder before every director. "This is precisely the meeting we intended to attend." Several directors opened their folders. Confusion quickly replaced curiosity. Marcus remained standing. "My name is Marcus Bennett." His voice was measured and professional. "As of 11:43 p.m. Saturday evening, I became independent chairman of the board of Whitmore Industrial Systems." The room froze. Charles stared at him without speaking. Marcus continued. "The ownership structure of Whitmore Industrial Systems changed following the successful completion of a negotiated acquisition by Lakefront Capital Partners and its investment consortium." Brandon laughed once, a short, dismissive laugh. "I'm sorry." He looked around the room. "Oh, is this supposed to be some kind of joke?" Daniel calmly placed a certified document onto the table. "It is not." Thomas Reynolds spoke next. "The transaction closed after receiving all required approvals, lender authorizations, regulatory clearances, and shareholder consents." He slid additional copies toward the directors. "Certified documentation has been provided." Charles slowly opened the first page. His eyes moved across the legal language. The confidence that had defined him for decades did not disappear all at once. It faded gradually, almost imperceptibly. Patrick watched quietly. He felt no satisfaction, only recognition. This was the exact moment when certainty collided with documented reality. Brandon reached for another document. "No." His voice became sharper. "This can't be right." Thomas answered calmly. "It has already been verified. We never approved this." The necessary approvals were obtained from the appropriate ownership interests. Charles looked directly at Daniel. "You've been negotiating behind my back." Daniel answered evenly. "We negotiated with every party legally entitled to negotiate." Charles's jaw tightened. "You should have come to me." Daniel remained composed. "We attempted discussions 18 months ago." Charles said nothing. Daniel continued. "They were declined." Rebecca Hayes quietly arranged several binders near the center of the table. No one paid attention yet. They remained focused on the acquisition itself. Marcus resumed speaking. Effective immediately. He looked toward the board. Governance responsibilities transfer under the resolutions contained in your folders. Brandon interrupted. This is absurd. Marcus did not raise his voice. You'll have an opportunity to review every document. Brandon stood abruptly. I'm Chief Financial Officer. Marcus nodded. You were. The room became silent again. Thomas opened another folder. Pending completion of independent financial review executive authority for Charles Whitmore and Brandon Whitmore is temporarily suspended. Brandon stared at him. You can't suspend me. Thomas answered without emotion. The board already has. Charles finally spoke. What exactly are you accusing us of? Patrick noticed something important. Thomas never answered that question. Thomas never answered that question. Instead, Rebecca Hayes did. We are not making accusations. She placed one binder onto the table. We are beginning an independent review. Another binder followed. Document preservation begins immediately. A third. All conclusions will be supported by evidence. Patrick appreciated every word. Evidence first, conclusions later. Exactly as it should be. Charles slowly looked toward Patrick. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Charles asked the question everyone else was already thinking. You knew, Patrick answered honestly. I knew the acquisition was being completed. Melanie looked at him. When the negotiations lasted 11 months, her face lost color. You never told me. Patrick met her eyes briefly. I legally couldn't. Brandon slammed both hands onto the table. You expect us to believe that... Patrick looked toward him calmly. I don't expect you to believe anything. He nodded toward the documents. I expect everyone to read. The sentence landed harder than an argument ever could. Marcus addressed the room again. Employees have not yet been informed. He looked at every director individually. Our first priority is maintaining operational stability. Patrick spoke for the first time since entering the room. No layoffs. Every head turned toward him. He continued quietly. Factories continue operating. Another sentence. Payroll continues without interruption. Another. Customer orders continue shipping. Finally. This company employs nearly 4,000 people. Patrick rested both hands lightly on the conference table. They are not responsible for today's meeting. Several independent directors slowly nodded. One older director, who had served on the board for nearly 15 years, spoke for the first time. I support that. Another agreed. As do I. Marcus acknowledged both. Then let the minutes reflect unanimous agreement. Outside the boardroom, employees had begun noticing unusual activity. Several unfamiliar attorneys walked through executive offices carrying sealed evidence boxes. Information technology specialists replaced security credentials. Administrative assistants whispered quietly in hallways. No one understood what was happening. Rumors spread within minutes. Inside the executive suite, Brandon attempted logging into the financial system once more. Access denied. He looked toward the hallway. My credentials. An IT manager appeared at the doorway. I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore. The young manager looked genuinely uncomfortable. My instructions come directly from the board. Brandon stared at him. You've worked for me for 9 years. Yes, sir. And you're locking me out? The manager swallowed. I have to follow board authorization. Patrick watched silently. He recognized the fear in the young employee's face. The man wasn't choosing sides. He was simply following lawful instructions, exactly as Patrick hoped every employee would. Charles slowly closed the acquisition documents. His expression had changed, not defeated, calculating. He looked toward Marcus. "This isn't over." Marcus answered respectfully. "No, it isn't." Then Rebecca Hayes placed the first evidence binder directly in front of Charles. The cover carried only 3 words: Independent Financial Review. Patrick knew what waited inside. Months of verified documentation, hundreds of pages, thousands of individual records. For nearly a year he had remained silent because evidence required time. Now the evidence had finally entered the room. And for the first time since anyone had spoken that morning, Charles Whitmore stopped talking entirely. No one reached for the evidence binder at first. It rested in the center of the polished walnut table, like an object everyone understood but no one wanted to touch. Patrick remained standing near the far end of the room. He watched the faces around the table instead of the documents. For years he had learned to recognize the first moments after uncomfortable truths entered a room. Some people became angry, some denied reality, others became unusually quiet. Charles Whitmore chose silence. Brandon chose anger. Marcus Bennett looked toward Rebecca Hayes. "Please begin." Rebecca opened the first archive box. Inside were neatly organized binders separated by colored tabs. Every section carried a date. Every page contained supporting documentation. Nothing inside relied on assumptions. She placed the first binder before each director. The title read Capital Expenditures and Asset Verification. Rebecca spoke in the same calm tone she had used throughout the due diligence process. "Our review covered the previous 5 fiscal years." She turned to the first page. "We independently verified every major capital investment publicly announced by Whitmore Industrial Systems." A chart appeared on the large presentation screen. Columns compared announced investment values against verified equipment installations. Several directors leaned forward. Rebecca continued. "In multiple facilities, modernization budgets were approved and publicly disclosed." She changed the slide. "However, physical inspections, supplier invoices, depreciation schedules, and equipment serial numbers indicate that portions of those projects were either delayed or only partially completed." Charles finally spoke. "Delayed projects aren't unusual." Rebecca nodded. "Correct." She never argued. She simply changed to another slide. "What is unusual?" Another chart appeared. DIPO is continuing to report the full modernization value without updating lenders regarding implementation delays. The room became quiet again. Patrick noticed something important. Rebecca never accused anyone of fraud. She simply compared documented events with reported representations. Facts. Nothing more. Brandon crossed his arms. "Those projects were phased." Rebecca nodded again. "We considered that explanation." She displayed another document. "Here are the approved construction schedules." Another. "Here are the contractor payment records." Another. "And here are the final inspection reports." The dates failed to match, not by weeks, by nearly 18 months. One independent director adjusted his glasses. "Why wasn't the board informed?" No one answered. Rebecca moved to the second binder, Vendor Payment Analysis. Patrick remembered the weeks she had spent verifying every figure. No shortcuts, no speculation, only records. Rebecca displayed a timeline. "For nearly 3 years." She highlighted one section. "Average payment cycles to several critical suppliers increased from 34 days to 97 days. A director frowned. "Cash preservation." "Possibly," Rebecca answered carefully. "But the increase was never disclosed during quarterly operational reviews." Brandon leaned forward. "Late payments aren't illegal." "No," Rebecca agreed immediately. "They are not." She looked around the room. "But representing vendor relationships is unchanged while internal records show growing payment delays creates governance concerns." Patrick admired her discipline. She never overstated, never exaggerated, never dramatized. Evidence didn't need drama. The document spoke clearly enough. Thomas Reynolds opened another folder. We also requested statements from several long-term suppliers. He distributed copies. They confirmed repeated payment renegotiations. Charles looked toward him sharply. Suppliers complain all the time, Thomas answered evenly. They also provided dated correspondence. Again, documents, not opinions. Rebecca advanced to the next section. Deferred maintenance. Large photographs filled the presentation screen. Hydraulic presses, assembly robots, industrial compressors. Every image carried inspection dates, maintenance reports, equipment identification numbers. Patrick recognized several facilities immediately. He had visited one of them years earlier. Rebecca spoke quietly. Several production systems continued operating beyond recommended service intervals. She enlarged one maintenance report. Repeated repair requests were deferred. Another document. Replacement approvals postponed. Another. Safety recommendations delayed. One director looked visibly unsettled. Were there injuries? Rebecca answered honestly. No catastrophic incidents. She paused. But increasing operational risk. Patrick finally spoke. Factories don't usually fail suddenly. Everyone looked toward him. They fail because small maintenance decisions accumulate over time. Silence followed. No one challenged the statement, because everyone who understood manufacturing knew it was true. Rebecca continued. The next section concerns pension funding. Charts appeared showing contribution schedules, projected obligations, funding ratios. Patrick noticed Melanie studying every page without speaking. She had always worked in marketing. Much of this information appeared completely unfamiliar to her. Rebecca pointed toward one graph. The pension remained legally funded. She emphasized the word legally. However required, future contributions increased substantially, while internal projections presented lower long-term obligations. An older director looked toward Charles. Were we shown these forecasts? Charles answered carefully. We were shown management estimates. Rebecca responded politely. Our review located alternative internal projections. She placed another document onto the table. Prepared 6 months earlier. The difference between the two projections was significant. No one spoke. Brandon's confidence had begun disappearing. He flipped through pages rapidly, searching, looking for errors, finding none. Rebecca moved to the final binder, communications with commercial lenders. Thomas stood beside her. I'll address this section. He projected several letters onto the screen. These communications described capital project completion percentages. Another document appeared beside the first. Independent inspection reports. The numbers differed. Again, not dramatically, but consistently. Thomas folded his hands. Our responsibility today is not assigning intent. He looked toward every director. It is identifying discrepancies requiring investigation. Patrick appreciated that sentence more than anyone else in the room. Intent belonged in courtrooms. Evidence belonged in boardrooms. Marcus Bennett addressed the directors. The independent review continues. He looked directly at Charles. You will have every opportunity to respond. Charles finally closed the binder. His expression had changed completely. The confidence remained. But certainty had disappeared. He turned toward Patrick. You've wanted this for years. Patrick answered without hesitation. No. Charles frowned. You expect me to believe that... Patrick met his eyes calmly. I wanted the company healthy. He looked toward the photographs of factories displayed on the presentation screen. I wanted 4,000 employees protected. Then back toward Charles. I never wanted this meeting. The honesty unsettled the room. Patrick could have celebrated. He could have reminded everyone of Saturday night, of the laughter, of the divorce papers. Instead, he spoke only about workers. Melanie watched him carefully. Perhaps for the first time in years, she realized Patrick's priorities had never matched her family's assumptions. A knock interrupted the meeting. The boardroom door opened. The company's general counsel entered, carrying another sealed envelope. He looked unusually serious. "Mr. Bennett?" Marcus accepted the envelope. "What is it?" "The U.S. Attorney's Office and federal regulators have issued formal preservation notices." The room became completely still. Marcus opened the letter slowly. He read the first page, then handed it to Thomas. Thomas nodded once. "They're requesting preservation of all financial records, executive communications, board materials, vendor contracts, and electronic files." Brandon stood abruptly. "They're investigating us," Thomas answered carefully. "They're requesting documents." Charles looked toward Patrick again. "You contacted them?" Patrick shook his head. "No." Rebecca answered before anyone else could. "Our firm has legal reporting obligations once certain findings reach specific thresholds." She paused. "The notification process is automatic." Again, no revenge, no secret phone call, no dramatic betrayal, only procedures, only law. Marcus closed the letter. "Effective immediately, no company records may be altered, deleted, removed, or destroyed." He looked around the room. "That instruction applies equally to everyone." Outside the boardroom, employees continued working. Assembly lines continued producing components. Forklifts carried inventory. Engineers reviewed production schedules. Most workers still knew nothing beyond rumors of a board meeting. Patrick looked through the glass wall overlooking downtown Chicago. Thousands of ordinary people were beginning another workday. They deserved stability, not executive chaos. Marcus followed Patrick's gaze. "Our employee announcement goes out in 30 minutes. Patrick nodded. "Let's make sure they hear about stability before they hear about investigations." Marcus smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." As Rebecca closed the final binder, another member of the transition team quietly entered the room and leaned toward Marcus. He whispered only a few words. Marcus looked toward Patrick. "The media has arrived downstairs." Patrick looked back at the binders, then toward the window. Finally, he answered, "They can wait." The reporters gathered behind the security barriers outside Whitmore Industrial Headquarters before noon. News traveled quickly in Chicago's business community. 3 satellite trucks parked across the street. Camera operators adjusted tripods. Financial journalists refreshed their phones every few seconds, waiting for someone to emerge from the building with a statement dramatic enough to dominate the evening news. Inside, Patrick Sullivan ignored every notification. His phone vibrated constantly. National business networks requested interviews. Industry publications wanted comments. Former clients sent congratulatory messages. Patrick answered none of them. Instead, he stood inside the employee cafeteria. The room looked nothing like the executive boardroom upstairs. Plastic chairs, simple tables, coffee machines humming quietly against one wall. Nearly 200 employees had gathered after receiving an unexpected company-wide invitation. Many still wore safety glasses around their necks. Others carried clipboards from the production floor. Several supervisors whispered nervously. Rumors had already spread. Some believed the company had declared bankruptcy. Others feared immediate layoffs. One machine operator quietly told a coworker he expected to lose the job he had held for 26 years. Patrick heard the conversation while walking toward the front of the room. It reminded him exactly why he had accepted Daniel Carter's offer months earlier. Not because of ownership, because of moments like this. Marcus Bennett stepped to the microphone first. He welcomed everyone and briefly explained that Whitmore Industrial had entered a new phase of ownership. He spoke carefully. No complicated legal language, no financial jargon, only facts. When he finished, he looked toward Patrick. "Many of you have never met Mr. Patrick Sullivan." Several employees turned their attention toward the quiet man standing beside him. Patrick walked forward without notes. He rested both hands lightly on the podium. The room became silent. "My name is Patrick Sullivan." His voice carried naturally. "I've spent most of my career helping manufacturing companies recover from difficult periods." He paused briefly. "I've walked factory floors across Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan." Several employees nodded. "I know what uncertainty feels like." Another pause. "So I'd like to begin with what matters most." Patrick looked across the room. "No one in this company is losing a job today because ownership changed." The cafeteria remained silent for nearly 2 seconds. Then someone quietly repeated the sentence. "No layoffs." Patrick nodded. "No layoffs." The tension inside the room visibly shifted. Shoulders relaxed. People looked at one another. Some appeared almost confused. Patrick continued. "Your work built this company." He pointed gently toward the production buildings visible through the cafeteria windows. "Not board meetings." A few employees smiled. "Not headlines." Another. "And certainly not executives." The room responded with quiet laughter. Patrick wasn't trying to entertain anyone. He simply understood something executives often forgot. Workers respected honesty, not speeches. He continued. "Every scheduled paycheck will be issued. Every health insurance policy remains active. Every retirement contribution continues. We have enough work to keep producing." Another employee raised a hand. Patrick nodded toward him. The man stood. "My name's Joe." Patrick smiled. "Nice to meet you, Joe." "I've worked here 31 years. Patrick listened. "Should we start looking for other jobs?" The question echoed throughout the cafeteria. Patrick answered immediately. "No." Joe looked uncertain. Patrick continued. "You should continue doing the work you've always done." He paused. "Our responsibility is earning your trust." The room remained quiet. Patrick deliberately avoided promising miracles. Promises created expectations. Actions created confidence. After the meeting ended, employees slowly returned to work. Several stopped to shake Patrick's hand. Others simply nodded while walking past. He appreciated both equally. That afternoon, Patrick toured the primary manufacturing facility located outside Joliet. Unlike previous executives, he declined the prepared visitor route. "I'd like to see receiving first." The plant manager looked surprised. "Receiving?" "Yes." Most executives preferred polished demonstration areas. Patrick preferred loading docks. Receiving departments revealed whether operations truly functioned. Delivery schedules, inventory accuracy, supplier relationships. Real businesses started there. As he walked through the building, employees gradually realized who he was. Whispers spread. "That's the new chairman." "He doesn't look like one." Patrick smiled quietly after overhearing the second comment. He had heard similar observations throughout most of his career. One forklift operator accidentally blocked the aisle while staring toward him. The young man quickly apologized. "Sorry, sir." Patrick waved dismissively. "No problem." He looked at the pallet. "What's inside?" "Hydraulic valve assemblies." "Late delivery?" The operator blinked. "Actually," he checked the paperwork. 2 days early." Patrick smiled. "Good supplier." The young man laughed. "You know manufacturing." "I hope so." Several maintenance technicians later showed Patrick an aging hydraulic press. One technician hesitated before speaking. "We've been requesting replacement parts." Patrick examined the equipment carefully. "When?" "Almost 8 months." Patrick nodded. "No promises today." The technician understood. "But we'll review it." Unlike previous executives, Patrick took photographs himself. He recorded serial numbers. He asked maintenance questions. He requested repair histories. The technicians exchanged surprised glances. Someone upstairs finally cared about machinery. Late that afternoon, Patrick met with vendor representatives through video conference. Many looked skeptical. One supplier from Ohio spoke first. "We've heard ownership changed." "It has." "Our invoices." Patrick looked directly into the camera. "You'll receive a payment schedule before Friday." Another supplier asked, "Can we trust it?" Patrick answered honestly, "I wouldn't ask you to trust words." He paused. "Judge us by whether the payments arrive." The supplier slowly nodded. That answer sounded different from previous conference calls, because it carried no sales language, only accountability. Meanwhile, upstairs inside executive offices, Charles Whitmore and Brandon remained under administrative restrictions. Neither had been removed from the building. Neither had been publicly accused. Both retained legal counsel. Thomas Reynolds insisted every procedure remain transparent. Patrick agreed completely. Justice required process, not spectacle. Around 5 o'clock, Melanie unexpectedly appeared outside Patrick's temporary office. She knocked gently. He looked up from reviewing production reports. "Come in." She entered slowly. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Melanie asked, "May I sit?" Patrick nodded. She remained standing instead. "I watched the employee meeting." Patrick waited. "I expected something different." "What did you expect?" She looked toward the window. "I thought—" Her voice became quieter. "I thought you'd embarrass my family." Patrick answered almost immediately. "What would that accomplish?" Melanie searched his face. "They embarrassed you." Patrick closed the production report. "They already made that choice." Silence returned. She looked genuinely confused. "I don't understand you anymore." Patrick smiled sadly. "You probably never did." The sentence carried no bitterness, only truth. She looked down briefly. "I'm sorry about Saturday." Patrick nodded once. "So am I." Another long silence followed. Finally, she asked the question that had clearly troubled her all day. "Did you buy the company to get revenge?" Patrick answered without hesitation. "No." "Then why?" He looked toward the production floor below. Workers continued loading trucks. Engineers walked between assembly lines. Forklifts moved steadily through marked lanes. "Because companies can recover." He paused. "But bankruptcy destroys families who had nothing to do with executive decisions." Melanie followed his gaze through the window. For the first time, she looked beyond the corporate headquarters, beyond the boardroom, beyond her family's name. She looked at the people actually building the products. Without another word, she quietly left the office. Patrick returned to his reports. Minutes later, his assistant entered, carrying another stack of interview requests. CNBC, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, Forbes. Patrick glanced briefly at the list. "Decline them." The assistant looked surprised. "All of them?" "Yes." "You don't want to tell your story." Patrick picked up another maintenance report. "My story isn't the important one." He looked toward the factory floor again. "Getting this place healthy is—" Outside television cameras continued waiting. None of them realized the man they wanted to interview had already decided that rebuilding factories mattered far more than becoming famous. 3 weeks passed before Patrick Sullivan finally spent an entire day away from the Chicago headquarters. The crisis had settled into routine. Factories continued producing. Suppliers had begun receiving scheduled payments exactly when promised. Customers noticed almost no disruption. Inside the executive offices, however, everything felt different. Weekly meetings no longer revolved around stock photographs for annual reports or presentations designed to impress lenders. Instead, they focused on machine uptime, safety inspections, inventory accuracy, employee retention. Patrick preferred it that way. At 6:30 on a Tuesday morning, he drove his familiar sedan south toward Joliet. His first stop was the company's oldest manufacturing facility, a plant that had produced hydraulic components for more than 50 years. The parking lot was already half full when he arrived. Workers recognized the car before they recognized the man. One maintenance mechanic smiled as Patrick climbed out. "You really drive that every day?" Patrick looked toward the sedan. "It still runs." The mechanic laughed. "So do some of our machines." Patrick smiled. "Let's fix both before they stop." Word spread quickly that the chairman had arrived. Unlike previous executive visits, there were no photographers, no prepared speeches, no freshly painted walkways. Patrick requested something much simpler. "I'd like breakfast with the first shift." The cafeteria supervisor looked surprised. "You mean here?" Patrick nodded. "If that's where everyone else eats." 20 minutes later, he sat beside welders, forklift operators, electricians, machinists, and quality inspectors. The breakfast wasn't elegant. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee, bacon, plastic trays. Patrick considered it one of the most productive meetings of the week. No PowerPoint presentation could replace listening. A machinist named Carl finally spoke. "We've had 3 chairmen." Patrick looked up from his coffee. "You've met all of them?" Carl nodded. "You're the first one to ask how the machines are doing before asking how production numbers look." Several employees nodded in agreement. Patrick answered honestly. "The machines create the production numbers." Quiet laughter spread across the table. Another employee raised a concern. "Our training budget disappeared 2 years ago." Patrick made a note. "What kind of training?" "New CNC programming." Another technician joined the conversation. "We've got younger workers who want to learn." Patrick wrote another line inside the notebook. "Training, apprenticeships, technical certification." He asked no one to promise anything. He simply collected facts. Later that morning, he toured the maintenance department. Shelves held replacement parts carefully organized by equipment type. One storage rack stood almost empty. Patrick stopped walking. "What belongs there?" The maintenance supervisor sighed. "Hydraulic pump assemblies. Well, out of stock." "We delayed ordering them." "Why?" "No budget approval." Patrick looked toward the production floor, where aging equipment continued operating. "How many machines depend on those parts?" 27. Patrick wrote the number down. He turned toward the plant manager. "I'd like a replacement proposal by Friday." The manager blinked. "Friday?" "Yes." "I thought we'd need 6 months." Patrick smiled gently. 6 months is how equipment becomes expensive." The manager laughed quietly. "I'll have it." By lunchtime, Patrick was driving toward another facility in northwest Indiana. This plant specialized in industrial valve systems. Unlike the first factory, morale here appeared noticeably lower. Break room conversations stopped when executives entered. Employees looked cautious. Patrick immediately sensed why. The previous leadership had visited only when production targets were missed. Workers associated executive visits with bad news. Patrick spent nearly an hour simply introducing himself. No speeches, no announcements, just conversations. One employee asked cautiously, "Are you really staying?" Patrick smiled. "I don't understand." "The last executives visited once." The man shrugged, then disappeared. Patrick answered without hesitation. "I'll be back." That afternoon he walked through every department: assembly, packaging, shipping, receiving, maintenance, quality control. He asked the same question repeatedly. If you could fix one thing tomorrow, what would it be? The answers surprised no one familiar with manufacturing. Better lighting, updated forklifts, modern software, replacement tooling, safer loading docks. None required billion-dollar investments. Most required attention. Patrick noticed something else. People rarely complained about working hard. They complained when obvious problems remained ignored. That evening, he returned to Chicago carrying pages of handwritten notes. Daniel Carter waited in the conference room. "You look exhausted," Patrick smiled. "I talked more today than I usually do in a week." Daniel pointed toward the notebook. "Anything interesting?" Patrick placed it on the table. "Everything." Daniel flipped through several pages. No dramatic discoveries. No accusations. Only observations. Improve lighting. Replace hydraulic pumps. Restore apprenticeship funding. Repair loading dock doors. Daniel looked up. "This is your turnaround plan." Patrick nodded. "Where are the billion-dollar strategies?" Patrick smiled. "Companies usually recover one good decision at a time." Daniel laughed. "You really believe that?" "I've watched it happen." The following week, Patrick traveled to Ohio, then Michigan. Every facility revealed the same pattern: dedicated employees, outdated equipment, managers trying to accomplish more with less, suppliers willing to continue relationships if someone finally honored commitments. Patrick refused luxury hotels whenever practical. Instead, he stayed near the plants. He wanted breakfast where employees ate breakfast, coffee where truck drivers bought coffee. One evening, inside a small diner outside Toledo, an older woman recognized him from a local newspaper. "You're the new chairman," Patrick nodded politely. "My husband worked at your plant for 28 years. Patrick smiled. "I hope he's enjoying retirement." The woman's expression softened. "He passed away last winter." Patrick lowered his head. "I'm very sorry." She smiled sadly. "He loved that company." After a moment, she added something else. "He would have liked you." Patrick didn't know how to respond, so he simply thanked her. Sometimes gratitude spoke louder than conversation. As weeks became months, small improvements accumulated. Machine downtime declined. Supplier confidence improved. Employee suggestions increased. Safety inspections identified fewer serious concerns. For the first time in years, managers began discussing long-term planning instead of short-term survival. Patrick rarely took credit. Whenever reporters asked about progress, Marcus Bennett handled the interviews. Patrick preferred factory floors. Late one Friday afternoon, while reviewing equipment proposals in his office, his assistant knocked gently. "You have a visitor." Patrick looked up. "Who?" "Melanie Whitmore." He remained silent for several seconds. "Did she schedule an appointment?" "No." Patrick closed the file before him. "Send her in." The assistant nodded and quietly left. A moment later, Melanie stepped into the office. She wore a simple navy business suit instead of the designer clothing Patrick had grown accustomed to seeing at family events. She looked tired, not physically, emotionally. She stood near the doorway without speaking. Patrick noticed something else. For the first time since he had met her years earlier, she seemed uncertain of herself. Finally, she broke the silence. "I was wondering," she hesitated, "if you'd have coffee with me." Patrick looked at her for a long moment, not as the chairman, not as the man she had divorced, simply as someone he had once loved. "When," she answered quietly. "Whenever you're ready." Patrick glanced toward the stack of factory reports waiting on his desk, then back toward Melanie. After several seconds, he nodded once. "I know a place by the river." Melanie managed the faintest smile. "So do I." Neither of them realized that the conversation waiting beside the Chicago River would become the first truly honest discussion they had shared in years. The cafe sat along the Chicago River, where office towers reflected across the water like polished steel. Patrick had discovered it years earlier during one of his first consulting projects in the city. It wasn't fashionable enough for executives trying to impress clients, which was exactly why he liked it. The coffee was good. The conversations were quiet. Nobody paid much attention to who sat at which table. He arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. He ordered black coffee, another old habit. The server recognized him. The usual? Patrick smiled. The usual? He chose a table outside, overlooking the riverwalk. Boats moved slowly beneath the bridges. Tourists paused to take photographs. Runners passed every few minutes. Life continued without caring that two people were about to close one chapter of their lives. Melanie arrived exactly on time. She wasn't dressed like the marketing executive who attended charity galas, no designer handbag, no expensive jewelry. Only a light blue blouse, dark slacks, and a simple jacket folded over one arm. She looked around until she found Patrick. For a brief moment, neither moved. Then she walked toward him. "Thank you for coming." Patrick stood politely. "I'm glad we chose somewhere quiet." She nodded. "So am I." They sat. For almost a full minute, neither touched their coffee. Neither seemed certain where to begin. Finally, Melanie spoke first. "I rehearsed this conversation." Patrick looked at her. "For days." "And?" She smiled weakly. "I forgot every word." Patrick couldn't help smiling slightly. "That usually means the conversation will be honest." She looked down at the coffee cup. "I hope so." Another silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. For years they had spoken about schedules, meetings, family dinners, vacations that never happened. Very little about themselves. Melanie finally lifted her eyes. "I owe you an apology." Patrick remained quiet. "I don't expect forgiveness." She paused. "I just needed to say it." Patrick nodded once. "I'm listening." She took a slow breath. When I handed you those divorce papers," her voice became softer, "I thought I understood exactly who you were." Patrick waited. "I thought you were hiding ambition because you were afraid to compete." She laughed sadly. "I thought driving that old car meant you never wanted more." Patrick said nothing. "I thought quiet meant weak." The words hung in the air. For the first time, she heard herself saying them aloud. They sounded different now. Smaller. Embarrassing. Patrick finally spoke. "I know." Melanie blinked. "You knew?" Patrick nodded. "I've known for years." She looked genuinely confused. "Why didn't you ever defend yourself?" Patrick leaned back slightly. "My father used to tell me something." She waited. "If someone insists the sky is green." He smiled faintly. "Arguing won't change the color." Melanie lowered her eyes. "I believed my family." "I know. I should have believed you." Patrick answered quietly. "Maybe." The server arrived with fresh coffee. Neither touched it immediately. Melanie looked toward the river. "I've replayed that night at the hotel over and over." Patrick remained silent. "I kept expecting to remember you shouting." She smiled bitterly. "But you never did." "No. I kept waiting for you to embarrass my father." Patrick looked toward the water. "I wasn't interested." She looked back at him. "How?" Patrick understood the real question. How had he remained calm while being humiliated in front of 200 people? He answered honestly. "By the time you handed me those papers," he paused. "I had already accepted that our marriage was ending." Melanie's expression changed. "When?" "Long before the anniversary dinner." She swallowed quietly. "You knew." "I noticed." She looked down. "The phone call," Patrick nodded. "The law office accidentally called me." Her shoulders dropped. "I wondered if they had." Patrick smiled gently. "They did." Another silence. This one carried regret neither of them could change. Finally, Melanie asked the question she had carried since the board meeting. "Did you ever stop loving me?" Patrick looked across the river before answering. I don't think feelings disappear because paperwork arrives. She listened carefully. But trust changes. He met her eyes again, and eventually love has nowhere safe to stand. She closed her eyes briefly. A tear escaped, despite her attempt to stop it. Patrick noticed. He pretended not to. Not because he didn't care, because dignity sometimes meant allowing another person privacy, even while sitting across from them. Several moments passed. When Melanie finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. I need to ask something. Go ahead. Why didn't you tell me about the acquisition? Patrick answered without hesitation. Because I legally couldn't. I would have kept the secret. Patrick smiled sadly. I believe you think that. She frowned. You don't believe me? I believe secrets become very heavy. He looked towards the river. And you were spending almost every evening with your parents. Understanding slowly crossed her face. She realized what Patrick had quietly avoided saying. If she had known even unintentionally, her family might have learned. Not through malice. Through ordinary conversation. Through worry. Through emotion. Confidential transactions had collapsed for far less. She nodded slowly. I understand, Patrick continued, and there was another reason. She looked up. If the acquisition failed, he shrugged gently. I didn't want to build our marriage on promises that might never become reality. She stared at him. So when everyone thought you were ordinary, Patrick smiled. I let them. Why? Because the work mattered. Not the image, not the reputation, not the assumptions. The work. Melanie looked at him for a long time. I spent years trying to make you fit into my family's world. Patrick nodded once. I know. I never had asked whether their world deserved you. The sentence surprised even her. Patrick remained quiet. He had learned that people reached their deepest realizations only when no one interrupted them. Melanie wiped another tear away. My father still believes you planned everything. Patrick looked almost amused. He probably always will. You don't hate him, Patrick answered after thinking carefully. Hate requires too much attention. She almost laughed. That sounds like something you'd write in that notebook. Patrick smiled. I probably already have. For the first time that afternoon, both of them laughed together. The sound lasted only a few seconds, but it reminded them of people they used to be. Eventually, Melanie became serious again. The divorce paperwork. Patrick nodded. I've signed everything. I know. I'm not contesting anything. She looked surprised. You aren't? Patrick shook his head. No. Why? Because forcing people to stay connected never repairs what's already broken. She looked out across the water once more. I don't deserve your kindness. Patrick answered gently. This isn't kindness. She looked back. It's acceptance. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the river. Office workers hurried past. A saxophone player performed farther down the walkway. The city remained wonderfully indifferent. Melanie finished the last sip of her coffee. I don't think we'll ever be friends. Patrick nodded. Probably not. But she searched for the right words. Yeah, I hope someday you'll remember me without thinking about that ballroom. Patrick considered the question. I don't think that's what I'll remember. She frowned slightly. What will you remember? Patrick smiled softly. A rainy night at a charity fundraiser. Her eyes widened. The coffee station. You were reading the captions under every photograph. You noticed. I noticed. She laughed quietly. I asked why you weren't talking to the donors. Patrick finished the memory. And I said the students would actually build something. They smiled at the same memory. For a brief moment, the years between then and now disappeared. Then reality returned. Melanie stood slowly. So this is goodbye. Patrick stood as well. I think it is. She hesitated, then extended her hand. Patrick looked at it for only a moment before shaking it. No embrace, no dramatic farewell, just two adults acknowledging that some stories ended quietly. Melanie released his hand. I hope you build something worth remembering. Patrick smiled. I'm trying. She walked away along the riverwalk without looking back. Patrick watched until she disappeared into the afternoon crowd. Only after she was gone did he sit down again. His phone vibrated. Marcus Bennett had sent a short message. Regulatory findings become public tomorrow morning. Board meeting at 8:30. Patrick looked once toward the direction Melanie had walked. Then he placed the phone back into his pocket. Tomorrow would not be about his past. It would be about accountability. The first official findings became public on a gray Thursday morning. By 8 o'clock, every major business publication in Chicago carried nearly identical headlines. Federal regulators had confirmed the existence of governance failures inside Whitmore Industrial Systems. The reports were careful. No dramatic accusations, no sensational language. Only documented findings, procedural concerns, and notices that several civil proceedings would continue while investigators reviewed thousands of records. Patrick read every article. He folded the newspaper neatly and placed it beside his coffee. Then he left for work. At headquarters, reporters again waited outside. This time there were more cameras, more microphones, more questions. A security officer approached Patrick before he reached the entrance. They've been here since 6. Patrick smiled politely. I figured. They're asking if you'll make a statement. Patrick shook his head. The company already has one. The security officer nodded. Our communications team released it 30 minutes ago. Good. Patrick walked into the building without slowing. Inside, employees had already returned to their routines. Shipping schedules covered whiteboards. Production supervisors reviewed overnight reports. Engineers discussed equipment upgrades. Life inside the company continued moving forward. Patrick considered that a far greater achievement than appearing on television. At 9 o'clock, the board assembled. Marcus Bennett opened the meeting. The public findings change nothing about today's priorities. He looked around the room. Production. Safety. Employees. Customers. Patrick appreciated the order. Those priorities deserved to come before headlines. Rebecca Hayes distributed another progress report. The independent review is substantially complete. She turned several pages. Additional documentation has been forwarded to the appropriate regulatory agencies. Thomas Reynolds added quietly, Civil proceedings will now move through the courts. Patrick listened without comment. Justice belonged to judges. His responsibility remained the company. Later that morning, he toured the engineering department. Several younger engineers gathered around a prototype hydraulic system designed to reduce energy consumption. One of them looked surprised to see him. Mr. Sullivan. Patrick smiled. Morning. We weren't expecting. The engineer hesitated. The chairman. Patrick looked toward the prototype. I wasn't expecting to interrupt. The young engineer laughed nervously. Patrick stepped closer. Tell me about it. Within minutes, the engineers were enthusiastically explaining pressure efficiency, redesigned valve geometry, and projected manufacturing costs. Patrick listened carefully. He asked practical questions. Production rates, maintenance requirements, supplier availability. Not once did he mention the regulatory findings released that morning. Neither did the engineers. By the time Patrick left, they had forgotten they were speaking with the chairman. They were simply discussing manufacturing. Exactly the way he preferred. Around lunchtime, Marcus entered Patrick's office carrying another folder. "The legal team wanted you to review this." Patrick opened it. Several pages summarized the current status of ongoing civil litigation. Charles Whitmore, Brandon Whitmore, several former senior financial executives. Patrick read quietly. Marcus watched him. No reaction. Patrick closed the folder. "What reaction would help?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Most people would feel vindicated." Patrick leaned back. "I don't." Marcus looked genuinely curious. "Why?" Patrick considered the question. "Because none of this creates a single new job." He looked toward the factory beyond the office window. "It doesn't repair one machine. It doesn't train one apprentice." Marcus nodded slowly. "You really don't think like most executives." Patrick smiled. "I've never wanted to." That afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. Brandon Whitmore. Thomas Reynolds informed Patrick beforehand. He requested a meeting. Patrick looked up. "With me?" Thomas nodded. "You have every right to refuse." Patrick thought for several seconds. "No." Thomas waited. "I'll meet him." The meeting took place inside a small conference room. No lawyers, no reporters. Only Patrick and Brandon. Brandon entered looking older than Patrick remembered. Weeks of legal uncertainty had replaced the confidence he once carried so effortlessly. He remained standing. "I won't waste your time." Patrick gestured toward the chair. "You can sit." Brandon ignored it. "I came because I need an answer." Patrick remained calm. "What answer?" Brandon looked directly at him. "Did you plan all this from the beginning?" Patrick answered immediately. "No." Brandon frowned. "You expect me to believe that—" Patrick nodded toward the chair again. This time Brandon sat. Patrick spoke quietly. "When I married Melanie," he paused. "I had no interest in owning Whitmore Industrial." Brandon remained silent. "I wanted a marriage." Another pause. "I wanted your family to know me." Brandon looked down briefly. Patrick continued. "The acquisition happened because the company needed help." Brandon shook his head. "You could have let it fail." Patrick answered with surprising firmness. "No." "Why not?" Patrick leaned slightly forward. "Because failure would have destroyed thousands of people who never sat at this table." The words stayed between them. Brandon stared at the floor. For years he had assumed Patrick viewed business as a competition. Only now did he begin realizing Patrick viewed business as responsibility. After several minutes, Brandon finally spoke again. "My father still thinks you'll destroy everything he built," Patrick answered honestly. "I've spent every day trying to preserve what deserved saving." Brandon looked at him. "You really believe that?" "I know it." Silence returned. Eventually, Brandon stood. "I don't know if I'll ever agree with what happened." Patrick nodded. "You don't have to." "But—" Brandon hesitated. "I think I misjudged you." Patrick smiled gently. "Maybe we both spent too much time listening to assumptions." Brandon extended his hand awkwardly. Patrick shook it. Not as friends, not as enemies, simply as two men accepting reality. After Brandon left, Thomas entered almost immediately. "How'd it go?" Patrick smiled faintly. "Better than I expected." Thomas looked surprised. "No argument?" "No." "No accusations?" Patrick shook his head. "Just conversation." Thomas laughed quietly. "I keep forgetting who I'm talking to." That evening, Patrick drove to the Joliet facility for another employee town hall. Unlike the first meeting after the acquisition, the atmosphere felt lighter. Employees smiled more easily. Questions focused on equipment upgrades rather than layoffs. One veteran welder stood near the back of the room. "I've been here 38 years." Patrick nodded respectfully. The man continued. "I've worked under 4 chairmen." He paused. "You're the first one whose name doesn't matter much on the production floor." Patrick looked puzzled. The welder smiled. "People don't talk about you. They talk about what got fixed." Laughter spread throughout the room. Patrick laughed too. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." The applause that followed lasted longer than Patrick expected, not because employees admired him, because they believed the company finally belonged to people who understood it. Driving back toward Chicago that night, Patrick crossed the same bridge he had crossed hundreds of times before. The city lights reflected across the river. His phone rang. Marcus Bennett. Patrick answered through the hands-free system. "Everything okay?" Marcus sounded pleased. "Better than okay." Patrick waited. "The annual shareholder meeting is next week." "I know." Marcus smiled through the phone. "I think it's finally time to tell everyone where this company is going." Patrick looked ahead at the road disappearing beneath the headlights. For months, the story had been about uncovering the past. Now it was finally time to build the future. The annual shareholder meeting had always been Charles Whitmore's favorite event. For nearly 3 decades, he had stood on the same stage inside the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton, presenting polished slides, optimistic forecasts, and carefully rehearsed speeches about Whitmore Industrial Systems' future. This year, the ballroom looked almost identical. The banners remained. The company logo still hung above the stage. Rows of chairs filled the room. Shareholders, lenders, suppliers, and longtime employees gathered quietly, while reporters occupied the rear section with notebooks and cameras. Only one thing had changed. Charles Whitmore sat among the audience instead of behind the podium. Patrick noticed him immediately after entering. Charles wore the same tailored navy suit that had appeared in countless magazine interviews over the years. He remained composed, dignified. But for the first time since Patrick had known him, Charles was attending as a guest rather than the man directing the room. Patrick felt no satisfaction. Only the strange awareness that time eventually rearranged every seat. Marcus Bennett opened the meeting precisely at 9. He welcomed shareholders, reviewed attendance, completed the required procedural votes. Everything followed corporate governance rules exactly. No shortcuts, no theatrical moments. Only after the formal agenda concluded did Marcus look toward Patrick. "Our Chief Executive Officer and Executive Chairman, Patrick Sullivan, will provide this year's operational report." Patrick walked toward the podium carrying nothing except his familiar leather notebook. He did not connect a tablet. He did not request prepared slides. Several reporters looked surprised. Patrick rested the notebook on the podium but never opened it. He looked across the audience. Many faces were unfamiliar. Some had invested in Whitmore Industrial for decades. Others represented pension funds, commercial lenders, or manufacturing associations. Many simply wanted reassurance. Patrick began quietly. "Good morning." The room settled immediately. "I've been asked several times over the past few months what our strategy will be." He paused. "My answer disappoints people looking for dramatic announcements." Several people smiled. "Our strategy begins with doing ordinary things consistently well." He looked toward several longtime employees seated near the front. "Pay suppliers on time. Maintain equipment before it fails. Train employees before they're needed. Tell lenders the truth." The room remained silent. Patrick continued. "Manufacturing isn't built on excitement. It's built on discipline." Several shareholders began taking notes. Patrick walked slowly away from the podium. No rehearsed gestures. No dramatic pauses. Only conversation. "When I first visited our facilities after the acquisition," he smiled faintly, "I expected to find complicated problems." He shook his head slightly. Most weren't complicated. He looked towards the audience. They had simply been ignored. A photograph appeared on the screen behind him. Not of executives, not of headquarters. A maintenance technician replacing hydraulic equipment inside the Joliet facility. Another photograph followed. 2 apprentices learning CNC programming, then another. Forklift operators unloading raw materials before sunrise. Patrick pointed toward the screen. These people saved this company. He paused. My responsibility was making sure they finally had the tools to do it. Applause began quietly, then spread throughout the ballroom. Patrick waited until it faded naturally. He refused to interrupt. The next slide displayed numbers. Not stock prices, not executive compensation. Machine downtime, on-time supplier payments, employee retention, safety incidents, production efficiency. Patrick explained each improvement without exaggeration. When we promised suppliers we'd pay them on schedule, he smiled. They believed us after the payments actually arrived. Soft laughter filled the room. When we promised employees there would be no layoffs. Another pause. We kept that promise. More applause. When we promised customers stable deliveries. He nodded toward several representatives seated together. They continued placing orders. Everything Patrick described connected directly to actions already completed. No impossible projections, no inflated forecasts, only measurable progress. Near the back of the ballroom, several reporters quietly lowered their cameras. The story unfolding before them differed completely from what they had expected. There was no revenge, no public humiliation, no celebration over another family's downfall, only manufacturing, only leadership. Patrick eventually closed the operational report. I'd like to finish with one observation. He looked slowly across the room. I've learned that companies don't belong to the people whose names appear on buildings. Silence settled again. They belong to everyone who arrives before sunrise. Everyone who fixes broken machines. Everyone who loads trucks. Everyone who answers customer calls. Everyone who believes tomorrow's work matters. He paused one final time. If we remember that. He smiled. The company will take care of itself. The applause lasted much longer this time. Patrick stepped away from the podium. Marcus returned briefly to conduct remaining business. Then came the question and answer session. The first shareholder stood. Mr. Sullivan. Patrick nodded. You've restored operational stability. Yes. What comes next? Patrick answered immediately. Investment. In what? People. The shareholder smiled. And after that? Better equipment. Another investor raised a hand. What about acquisitions? Patrick shook his head. We're not buying companies. The investor looked surprised. No expansion, Patrick answered calmly. We already own enough responsibility. Several shareholders laughed appreciatively. Another question came from a reporter. Mr. Sullivan. Patrick nodded. Do you have any comment regarding the Whitmore family's ongoing legal proceedings? The ballroom became completely quiet. Everyone waited. Patrick answered after several thoughtful seconds. The legal system exists for a reason, he continued. I respect that process. Another pause. I won't discuss individuals while that process continues. The reporter tried again. After everything that happened personally, Patrick smiled politely. My personal life isn't today's agenda. The answer ended the discussion. Charles Whitmore watched from the audience without moving. Patrick never looked toward him. Not because he wanted to avoid him, because this meeting wasn't about Charles. It wasn't about Patrick either. It belonged to the company. As shareholders slowly departed, many employees approached Patrick. Some thanked him. Others introduced family members. One retired machinist carrying a cane stopped beside him. I started here in 1978. Patrick smiled warmly. That's a long career. The older man nodded. I buried 2 friends who worked in these factories. Patrick listened carefully. They always said management forgot our names. He looked around the ballroom. I don't think they'll be saying that anymore. Patrick shook the man's hand firmly. Thank you for helping build the company. The retired machinist smiled. No. He looked directly at Patrick. Thank you for remembering who built it. Late that afternoon, after nearly everyone had left, Patrick stood alone inside the now empty ballroom. Workers quietly removed banners, hotel staff folded chairs, the stage lights dimmed one section at a time. Marcus Bennett walked over. You did well. Patrick smiled. So did everyone else. Marcus looked around the empty room. I've been thinking. Patrick waited. When this acquisition started, Marcus folded his hands. I assumed we were rescuing a manufacturer. Patrick looked towards the stage. And now? Marcus smiled. I think we rescued its culture. Patrick considered the words. Perhaps. Or perhaps the culture had never disappeared. Perhaps it had simply waited beneath years of executive distraction, ready to return the moment someone remembered where real value came from. As Patrick prepared to leave, his assistant hurried across the ballroom carrying a small envelope. It arrived this afternoon. Patrick accepted it. There was no return address. Inside rested a single handwritten note. No signature. Only one sentence. You were right. Quiet men are dangerous only to lies. Patrick folded the note carefully and slipped it inside his leather notebook. Then he walked out into the fading Chicago sunlight, unaware that one final chapter still remained before the story could truly end. Autumn arrived quietly in Chicago. The maple trees along Michigan Avenue turned shades of gold and crimson, while cool winds swept across Lake Michigan. Tourists filled the sidewalks, commuters hurried toward elevated train stations, and the city continued moving exactly as it always had. For Patrick Sullivan, life had become surprisingly ordinary again. He preferred it that way. 6 months had passed since the shareholder meeting. Whitmore Industrial Systems no longer dominated financial headlines. Reporters had found newer stories. Television crews had moved on. The excitement surrounding the acquisition had gradually disappeared. Inside the company, however, something far more important had happened. Normal had returned. Factories operated on schedule. Suppliers shipped materials without demanding advance payment. Customers renewed long-term contracts. Employee turnover reached its lowest level in nearly a decade. For Patrick, those quiet numbers meant far more than any newspaper headline ever could. One Monday morning, he walked through headquarters carrying the same worn leather notebook that had accompanied him since the beginning. The receptionist smiled. Good morning, Mr. Sullivan. Patrick smiled back. Morning, Lisa. She handed him a small envelope. Court delivery. Patrick thanked her before continuing toward his office. Inside, he opened the envelope. The divorce decree had become official. Patrick Sullivan and Melanie Sullivan were now legally divorced. The document contained only a few pages. Professional, respectful, without unnecessary language. He read every page carefully before placing it inside a desk drawer. There was no celebration. No sadness that overwhelmed him. Only acceptance. Some chapters ended quietly. This one deserved to. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus Bennett stepped inside. I thought I'd find you working. Patrick smiled. You usually do. Marcus noticed the envelope. The divorce. Patrick nodded once. It's final. Marcus sat across from him. How are you? Patrick considered the question honestly. Peaceful. Marcus smiled. That's a better answer than happy. Patrick nodded. Happiness changes. Peace lasts longer? Marcus laughed softly. You always sound like you've been writing books instead of running companies. Patrick looked towards the notebook. Maybe someday. They spent the next hour reviewing quarterly reports. Production efficiency had improved another 8%. Workplace injuries had declined significantly. Employee satisfaction surveys showed the strongest results in company history. Supplier relationships continued strengthening. Marcus closed the report. There's one more item. Patrick looked up. The employee ownership program. Patrick nodded. I've reviewed it. Marcus smiled. The first shares transfer next month. Patrick leaned back quietly. Months earlier, he had insisted that employees should eventually own part of the company they helped rebuild. Now the plan had finally become reality. No grand announcement, no publicity campaign, simply another promise fulfilled. Later that afternoon, Patrick drove to the original Joliet manufacturing facility. He enjoyed visiting without notice. Managers stopped preparing special tours because they eventually realized Patrick preferred seeing ordinary workdays. Inside the maintenance department, he immediately recognized Carl the machinist, who had once joked that Patrick was the first chairman to ask about machines before production numbers. Carl wiped grease from his hands and smiled. Back again. Patrick smiled. Thought I'd check on those hydraulic pumps. Carl laughed. You remember? Patrick nodded. I remember everything I write down. Carl pointed toward the production floor. They've been running perfectly. Patrick walked beside him through the facility. Many of the aging machines had been replaced. New apprentices worked alongside experienced technicians. The atmosphere felt different, lighter. Not because work had become easier, because uncertainty had disappeared. Near the end of the tour, a young apprentice approached Patrick nervously. Mr. Sullivan. Patrick turned. Yes? My grandfather worked here. Patrick smiled. Really? He retired before I was born. The young man hesitated. He always said management never knew who he was. Patrick listened carefully. The apprentice continued. I wish he could have seen this place now. Patrick looked around the factory. Forklifts moved steadily. Machines hummed rhythmically. Workers greeted one another naturally. I think, Patrick answered quietly. He'd recognized the people. The apprentice smiled. I think so too. Before leaving, Patrick visited the employee bulletin board. Photographs covered one section: company picnic, scholarship recipients, retirement celebrations, volunteer events. No executive portraits, no glossy promotional posters. Just employees. Exactly as it should be. That evening, Patrick drove toward Fort Wayne. He hadn't visited his parents' old neighborhood in months. His father had passed away several years earlier. His mother now lived in a smaller home, closer to family. Patrick stopped first at the cemetery. The autumn wind moved gently through the trees. He stood quietly before his father's headstone. No dramatic speech, no long conversation, only gratitude. After several minutes, he smiled. You were right. He almost laughed to himself. The old watch still works. The following Saturday, Patrick attended the dedication of Whitmore Industrial's new technical scholarship program. Students from across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan received financial support to study advanced manufacturing, robotics, engineering, and skilled trades. The ceremony remained intentionally modest. Several local high school teachers attended. Parents filled folding chairs inside the community college auditorium. Patrick spoke for less than 5 minutes. The future of American manufacturing. He looked toward the students. Doesn't begin in executive offices. It begins wherever someone decides to learn a useful skill. The students applauded politely. Patrick stepped away from the microphone almost immediately. He preferred listening to the scholarship recipients tell their stories. One young woman wanted to become a robotics engineer. Another student hoped to modernize his family's small machine shop. Patrick spent more time asking questions than giving advice. Driving back to Chicago that evening, his phone vibrated. A text message. From Melanie. It contained only one sentence. I heard about the scholarships. My father would have admired them years ago, even if he couldn't admit it. Patrick read the message twice. He smiled gently. Then he replied with equal simplicity, I hope he's doing well. Nothing more. No reopening old conversations. No searching for what had already ended. Some relationships found dignity in distance. Winter arrived several weeks later. Snow covered the sidewalks outside headquarters. Employees decorated break rooms for the holidays. The company hosted its annual Christmas gathering inside the main manufacturing facility, rather than a luxury hotel. Families attended, children toured production lines, retired employees returned to visit old friends. Patrick stood near the entrance greeting people as they arrived. No reserved executive table, no private dining room, just conversations. As the evening ended, Carl walked over carrying a wrapped package. For you. Patrick looked surprised. You didn't have to. Carl laughed. Open it later. After returning home, Patrick placed the package on the kitchen table. Inside rested a brand new leather notebook. The first page already contained handwritten words from everyone who finally had a leader who listened before speaking. Patrick closed the notebook slowly. He placed the old, worn notebook beside the new one. The first had carried observations that uncovered the truth. The second would carry plans for the future. Patrick walked toward the apartment window overlooking the Chicago River. The city lights reflected across the water exactly as they had the night Melanie handed him the divorce papers. Everything looked familiar, yet everything had changed. The Whitmore family had believed wealth proved worth. Patrick had quietly shown that character survived long after reputation disappeared. He never won because he became richer. He won because he remained the same man before the acquisition, during the investigation, and after the company recovered. Outside, another work week waited. Inside, Patrick turned off the lights, picked up the new notebook, and stepped forward into a future that no longer required anyone else's approval. The greatest victories in life rarely happen in front of an audience. They happen quietly in the moments when we choose patience over pride, integrity over shortcuts, and truth over the easy path. Patrick's journey reminds us that people will often judge us by what they can see: our clothes, our car, our job title, or our bank account. But character is revealed by the choices we make when no one is watching. Real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It simply keeps doing the right thing even when it is misunderstood. In the end, loud opinions fade, appearances change, and reputations rise and fall. What remains is the legacy we leave through honesty, responsibility, and the lives we positively impact. Perhaps you've experienced a moment when someone underestimated you, dismissed your potential, or assumed they knew your worth before giving you the chance to prove yourself. If so, remember this: you don't have to win every argument. You don't have to answer every insult. Sometimes the strongest response is to keep building your future while others are busy judging your present. Success earned with patience will always speak louder than revenge fueled by emotion. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance, your background, or the way you chose to live? How did you respond, and what did that experience teach you? Share your story in the comments. I read as many as I can, and your experience might encourage someone else who needs it today. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow we'll bring you another unforgettable story about resilience, unexpected